Hello, everybody. I'm Milene Guiar from Thornton International. Julian, Thornton, and I will be hosting this webinar today. Welcome, Alan. Thank you for joining us. And please feel free to introduce yourself and start the presentation, okay?
Okay, good morning or evening or afternoon or whatever it is where you are. I'm happy to be here. Alan Wyatt, independent consultant in non-revenue water and sorted other things. And today's topic is kind of long, as you can see by the title, but it's looking at what we call the technical rigor of water loss performance indicators, including apparent and real and total water loss, using a technique called frontier analysis, which in fact Dave Pearson first introduced me to. Here's my outline, and I'm going to go through A through F and probably G and stop there. I have a few slides on a possible new, maybe not quite so new, real loss indicator, which I will say is under discussion. Various people on this call have been looking at it. There's still some open questions, but I thought people might be interested if we have time. Okay. The origin of this work is from the Water Loss Control Committee of AWWA, which wanted a good, hard technical look at the indicators used in the free water audit software, which included the percentage indicators like non-revenue water volume oversupplied, and even a financial one of the value of the non-revenue water over total operating costs. And the committee knew that there were significant issues with those percentages. In undertaking a recommended change to remove that, substitutes or other indicators needed to be identified, which were quote unquote rigorous and that could be shown to be so. So there was a small project funded to Arcadis, and I was a sub that worked on the technical part of the project. But this is the plate of indicators, right, that are used in version 5. Version 6, as some of you know, is imminent. But the main issues, again, is that the percentages are very commonly used. 10%, the state of Maryland says if you're over 10%, you have to file a report. That's not what we want. And the lower part there are the criteria that the AWWA wanted the study to look at. Technical rigor, which I will explain what exactly I mean by that. Ease of calculation and use, understandability by various stakeholders, and compatibility with data and capabilities in North America. In other words, you don't want to make it hugely complicated to determine an indicator. That's the last point. Okay, now this particular effort went through certain iterations. The first was that AWWA report that I mentioned, which the cover page is there, and it's downloadable free from the AWWA website. The second iteration was at the Vancouver Benchmarking and Performance Assessment Conference, right around the same time as the publication of the AWWA report. And there's an article forthcoming in H2 Open describing the effort. And there have been some tweaks and adjustments through these different versions. Okay, by technical rigor, what I mean is that an indicator reflects the theory. In other words, it behaves like we think it should. If pressure goes up, we would expect more real loss, and therefore expect the indicator to perform as expected. The second major point is that it's widely applicable. In other words, you don't need other indicators to go with it, nor do you have to worry about scale or density, or not overly so, so as to facilitate comparisons. Now, this is a quote from my friend Stuart Trow, who said that the best indicator of all of the leakage is the leakage. If you divide it by anything, you've changed it. I certainly agree, but depending on what you divide it by, the change may be different. So we need a unit loss volume, whether it's real or apparent, in order to be able to compare utilities over time and place. And as an example, if you use real loss and you're starting with liters per day, do we divide by connections? Do we divide by length of mains, or those per unit of pressure, or unavoidable real losses? You know, each of these work well under many circumstances, but have some quirks in certain situations. So nothing being perfect, the objective was to look at the rigor of these different things. And it could end up that multiple indicators are rigorous. It's not that there's just one that works. In fact, having several is useful. And this slide is sort of one way to explain the methodology. Suppose we had a magic black box and we could enter attribute data of a utility like mains and connections, et cetera, and it could magically somehow produce accurate numbers for the water loss, volumes in particular. So if we had such a magic box, we could compare what different indicators show and the extent to which they correlate or align with those perfect numbers. The mystery black box, maybe not perfect, but the one that's attempted in this project was to use frontier analysis. And it can produce a number for the different losses and be the basis of comparison to indicators to assess the indicators. And frontier analysis has been used going back to the late 60s, maybe even before, for overall efficiency of utilities, not just leakage or losses. And it analyzes different utilities to identify a best performer, which sets an efficiency frontier. And then the distance in cubic meters or whatever to that frontier can be used to rank utilities or compare or compute an efficiency score. Now, this particular method, like I said, has been used for overall efficiency, but has been used a few times to look at water losses, including some of the suspects in the room. All right, now this is a little more on frontier analysis, and there are two types. One is called a deterministic approach, which I have colored in red. And what you have here is an efficiency frontier and a blue dot. I don't know if my mouse will work. I don't know, can you see the mouse? The inefficiency distance, so to speak, in a deterministic model is this larger one. But there's another type called the stochastic frontier analysis, which breaks out error or statistical noise from inefficiency. And it's quite a bit more complicated to implement, but knowing something more about the error in the performance number would be, I think, quite useful. Now, the model form, the frontier analysis involves a regression of system attributes, and this is the model form that's used. Various inputs, all logarithms, natural logarithms of various inputs are in an additive type model form, and that's known as the Cobb-Douglas formula. So this is just a little bit of background so people have a clue, you know, what this is all about, and that it is based in lots of previous work. Now I'm going to turn to the data sets that were used to do this analysis. And when this was started, a couple of years ago, we had certain data available. There's a lot more now, but 3 databases, one WADI Plus, which is a selection of utilities across the United States and Canada, some big, some small, and it uses the average aggregated numbers over that time period. 1 year from California, we've got a lot more, 272 utilities. Those are filtered out from a much larger population. And then Georgia with 150 or so audits for a single year. Georgia has been doing audits for quite a few years, so these should be audits from experienced utilities. You can see the ranges of the number of connections. The median is much smaller in Georgia, 5,000. The densities are smaller in Georgia. Pressures are about the same. There's the consumption of water in California, 1.7 cubic meters per connection per day. Wow. And these are costs and prices. I'm not going to go through. And then on this slide, we have some of the standard performance indicator values. You see the total water loss in California is fairly significantly lower. Again, these are medians. Apparent losses aren't too different, but Georgia's, double California roughly. We have apparent loss as a ratio of apparent loss plus build authorized consumption, which Dave pointed out in his definitions document that this would be a good way to develop this percentage indicator because it mirrors the meter test formulation, or the algebra of meter test formulation. Here we have the other sort of standard indicators, ILI being quite a bit lower in California. And then values in dollars per connection per year, just using the VPC or the sales price of water. So that's the data sets. Now this is the methodology for taking that general information on frontier analysis that I presented before to an operational process. And there's 5 steps. I'm going to go through each of them. So the first step is to take attributes of the utility and do a regression. And this is one example for California for the total water loss, to estimate it based on the number of connections, the build authorized consumption, length of mains, average pressure, the water price, which could be either just water or water and sewer, and the variable production cost. And there you have the model function using the logarithms in the Cobb-Douglas form. And then these are the regression results, and it's a overall R squared of 0.844. That's, you know, the ability to predict the total water loss from these input variables. And here we have the statistical significance, length of mains, length of connections, build authorized consumption is hugely significant. Pressure, barely at all. Again, this is total water loss. When you get into real losses, pressure has more of a statistical significance. But so for each of the 3 data sets, did the regression for total, real, and apparent. Then if you plot the predicted losses from the regression model against the observed, what you're really doing is saying, how does utility X compare to what the, let's say, average performance is for utilities with those attributes mathematically? So it's sort of a peer situation. And so if we took a predicted losses here, you can see that this one has an, are you seeing my, my mouse? This one has a, yes, no, can you see my mouse? Anybody? Oh, you guess you're all muted.
See your mouse.
Yes, Alan.
You can see it? What?
Not now.
Yeah.
Now, okay, all right. For a given predicted loss based on attributes, this utility has a lower observed loss than that one. So this is the better performer. And if it, the lowest, or the one that's the furthest from the average line, will define what we call a low frontier. Similarly, you could define a high frontier if that was of interest. So utility up here has a long way to go to get to the frontier. All right, here's a real case of that methodology for just 2016 in California, LADWP way up here. It looks like there either is a little bit of bias, or perhaps the big utilities aren't quite as good as some of the smaller ones. And
Definitely not. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, when I first looked at this, I was a little worried, but anyway, the thing that's also important to recognize here is that this place sets the low frontier. And if there's error or inaccuracy here, that could move the frontier line a little bit. But in the relative math that I'm doing, you'll see that that issue sort of takes care of itself, even though you would like to have the accuracy good. All right, so that's step 2, where we determine who's above and below the average. And then step 3 is to compute what I call a frontier score, which basically it's taking the ratio of the observed over predicted. So the bad performer has a high observed over predicted, and compare that to the minimum, that is the ratio of those two for the best performer. So typically the observed over predicted in a poor performer might be 3 or 4 or 5, that much over what they could be doing, whereas the minimum will be by definition 1, because they're observed, and no, I'm sorry, the frontier score will be 1. The minimum might be they're observed or 30% of the predicted, something in that range. So this frontier score gives you a non-dimensional relative distance to the frontier. Hold on a second. I'm just getting a note. Excuse me. Now, step 4 is to take that frontier score, which we believe is an accurate depiction of efficiency, and plot it against different indicators and judge the, let's say, degree of fit of the correlation or regression between any indicator and this frontier score. So here you have unit real loss and liters per connection per day. We have a correlation coefficient of 0.95, regression fit of 0.82. So that says that real loss, despite some scatter, or unit real loss and liters per connection per day, maps quite well against frontier score. So we can begin to have some confidence in the rigor of that indicator. Now, we're going to be looking at many others. Let me check my time here. All right. What I also did is in step 5, instead of having piles of R-squared numbers that are kind of complicated, I put them into baskets of scores from a 5, very high correlation, down to 1, which is, you know, very low. That is a poor indicator in terms of technical rigor at a 1 to an excellent at a 5. 5s are rare, 1s are rare. A lot of them are in 3s and 4s. All right, so those are the steps. And here we get into some results. And I've first taken total water loss. And part of the reason that we did total water loss is that in the top-down water balance, if apparent loss is not estimated correctly, then the resulting real loss is inaccurate. Same would be true in a broader sense for the system input volume, but we wanted to get the total water loss and not just on the basis of adding apparent and real in a top-down water balance. And in this case, the R-squared is 0.84. We have a good fit. This is the graph you saw before. And the width or the band from low to high performers is you know, reasonable. You'll see some others that are much broader in a minute. Now, this is the let's say, assessment of the indicators. And in this case, the unit water loss volume is not fantastic correlation, but 0.7 about. Things are not biased. They're fairly smooth, even though there's a scatter. Now, if we look at the value indicator, we see a lot more scatter, and it's not necessarily even, an R-square of 0.23. So that would result in a low technical rigor score. This is the summary for all 3 databases of total water loss. And you see the volumes range from a score of 3 to 4. And for the value, it's 1 to 2. Now, that doesn't say that the total water loss value is a worthless number. I think it's still useful in thinking about, you know, if my leak detection cost is so much per cubic meter and my value of water is some close amount of dollars per cubic meter, then that's useful in planning. But it isn't a good indicator of the volumetric performance of the utility. Still an interesting number, but not for performance assessment, but for planning. Okay, another illustration or set of results from Georgia, state of Georgia. And here we have a wider span from high to low frontier. We've got places like Atlanta, more urbanized, and then smaller, more rural, low density plastic pipe systems. Well, this is apparent loss, excuse me. The R squared isn't quite as good, but what we find is liters per connection per day have a pretty good fit. Strangely enough, so do the dollars per connection. I'm not quite sure why that is, but the ratio of apparent loss over the total throughput, so to speak, apparent plus billed authorized, is amazingly tight. Now, I will say that some members of the AWWA Water Loss Committee felt that this was not an indicator that should be used right now because a lot of the audits use defaults or estimates. So it could be that this time it comes out well due to the nature of the way the audits are completed. Personally, I still feel it's a worthwhile indicator to keep because over time, there will be better information on apparent loss, and this indicator, as time goes on, I think will be still valuable. All right, again, here are all the databases. I can't read my, maybe I can move people. I don't know how to do that. Okay, I've hidden the observers, the participants. You can see that apparent loss over apparent loss plus billed authorized gets a 5. The unit apparent loss volume ranges quite a bit depending on your location. And I think this has to do with attributes and materials and meters and different situational parameters that we didn't have sufficient data to put into the regression. If we can get more such data and put them into the regression and see changes, then we'll know that that would be true. The same is true for the unit apparent loss value. You see quite good correlations in these two data sets, but not that one. And I think, you know, there's still investigation needed here on why these variations are so big in certain places. There are certain indicators, I'll show you some in a minute, where it's 5s across the board or 4s across the board, which would indicate that those are bound to be rigorous in almost any circumstance. Okay, so here's the real loss, and this is using the WADI plus, the one that's spread across the country, different sizes, and multiple years put together. We have a pretty good regression fit, not too wide a span. These are the Rigor assessments of some different indicators. Liters per connection is good. Liters per kilometer is not so good. Liters per connection per meter of pressure is good, and ILI is good, although there's some low end. Somebody was reporting something around 0.3. Anyway, this is the overall technical rigor scores. The liters per connection per day is 4s all the way across the board. ILI is 4s all the way across the board. Liters per connection per day per unit pressure is somewhat variable, as is the kilometers. And by the way, I have a hint or a thought on why this is so high and this is lower, and it has to do with the materials of piping and the connections. This is what Julian was suggesting. We also have an indicator on ILI times the pressure management index, which comes out similar to the ILI itself, but it is a different indicator in terms of dealing with the reference pressure for the UARL. And lastly, the real loss value is poor in terms of rigor. And then I looked at the percentage ones, and with no cooking the numbers, they came out poor in technical rigor, which is sort of what we were hoping. The percentage indicators are not accurate, and this is mathematical demonstration of that. And the hope was that this would be some, let's say, justification for the unrigor of the percentage indicators. Whether that will change people's minds is another question. Anyway, it's 1 to 2 for volume over system input. The cost one is very low. Now, this is an indicator that I've seen in Europe sometimes, the real loss volume, that is, over the system input. In other words, how much of what you're pumping out of the river goes out through leaks. And that's a sort of a water resource concern. And in one case, at least, it was somewhat rigorous, but I think there's still going to be a consumption effect here. But it may still have some value to water resource specialists or people in that area. And again, the value indicator has low rigor. So this is a summary table of everything that you've seen, and the ones that are grayed out are not recommended. They don't rise to a 3. Now, what I've done here is I've shown the range of the technical rigor, like from 2 to 4, and I've put 1 check mark. These are columns for, you know, fit for the purpose, as Alan Lambert would say. These are purposes. And this indicator has a range of 5 to 5. So it gets 2 checks as being, let's say, more rigorous. And the ones with 1 check appear to be rigorous in some data sets, but not so much in others. And this is a different presentation that was done in the earlier report. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you'll have the video, and if anybody is interested in this presentation or papers associated with this work, you could email me. I'd be happy to send it to you. So what comes out of this are a few sort of, you know, good ones. The real loss per connection, the ratio measure of apparent losses, total unit total water losses, and others are sort of on the edge, and some are, you know, really not recommendable. Now I want to take a few minutes just to, well, this is a conclusion, excuse me. I think what this has shown is that frontier analysis can be useful for looking at indicators and just looking at water loss, who's good, who's not good. And One of the results is that our percentage indicators, as we might have hoped, come out low. The unit value indicators don't really reflect water loss volumetric performance, but are useful in planning. There are recommended volumetric and ratio indicators, but also no one indicator covers all purposes. It's useful to have several to really understand what's happening. I think there's some follow-up work with the newer data that's coming in to update this, and I wouldn't expect major changes, but to refine it a little bit more. So those are the conclusions of this indicator study. I want to do a couple of slides on some other applications for frontier analysis. And there's potentially quite a few interesting things that could be done. One would be identification of outliers. And you see, this is California with 3 years of data. I apologize to those of you who don't live in California. This is in acre feet per year. But you see all these utilities down here and a very broad range. So I would have to, or I would want to check what's going on with these places. Are they accurate audits? I would guess they're not. So outliers or questionable data could be identified that way. You can do performance assessment either as a whole state or the northern part of California, or those who use groundwater, by cohorts. You could determine percentiles, this is the 10th percentile. You could have a target that's not an economic target, but still a potential target on a percentile basis, and compute what reduction is needed from the current state down to the whatever percentile. Now, I'm also finding that if you calculate the optimum level of losses, it correlates to the frontier score. But there's still some fuzziness in this, and I'm still working on it. But if the frontier analysis could point us to the optimal, you wouldn't have to run the optimal model for every location. But whether we'll get the precision on it is not clear. Now, I mentioned earlier that there is the other type of frontier analysis, so stochastic, which will give us an indication of how much error may be contained in the distance to the frontier and how much may be due to other factors that have not been taken into account, such as other external variables like management of the company or scales, other factors, or the practices that are being undertaken. And I hope to move into a stochastic approach, particularly to look at the error and uncertainty here. How much of the inefficiency is error? That's something important to know. Okay, I'm going to stop there. It's about 20 over, a quarter of. We have a 15 minutes. We can have questions now or go into this other indicator. I really would ask the participants to let me know what they think or what they would prefer. And Milena, maybe you can unmute so people can voice their thoughts.
Yeah. We don't have any questions already. Islam is saying, please consider sharing the copy of these very important presentation slides.
Okay. No questions, wow. All right. Either nobody understood it or, all right. Well, being no questions, I'm going to move on to this other.
Kate is saying here, hi Alan, why was ILI not considered to be suitable PI for target setting, please?
Well, I have been told over a number of years that, including from Alan years ago that ILI was not an appropriate target setting method. And if his or other people's opinion have changed, I'd be interested to know that. But I think it is affected based on pressure. And if pressure is moving around, then it may not be a useful target. Now, I'm open to discussing that, but that's the rationale.
I've got another one here. Is California using this analysis to identify water utilities needing visits, inspections, or review of audit results?
Nope.
No.
And I am sort of surprised that that's the case. I've shown this to the Water Board in California, as well as the economic model that I have, and they're going their own direction. Now, I think that this can be useful. Georgia is quite interested in doing it. They've put off that process for a while due to some staffing issues. But I've run it for a number of places, and I think that as people begin to understand this more and not be afraid of something they don't know called frontier analysis, they might be more open to it. Because not only is it useful for looking at indicators, it gives a snapshot view of performance.
Okay. Chris Aubrey is asking, do you recommend for small systems to move real loss indicator per mile to per connection basis?
Well, I can't say I'm 100% sure, but I think that what I have found empirically in the audits in Georgia and in California and some other places, that due to a whole range of different influences, the often observed increase in the liters or gallons per connection at low densities by the UARL formula would go up for the same amount of leakage. There was a 20 connections per kilometer as a kind of a line in the sand, and I've found that the upward bend of the UARL happens later, and I think that is at smaller densities, and I think this may have to do with the work that Kate and Alan Lambert have been doing on various adjustments to the UARL. I'm not 100% sure about that, but they could describe in more detail. But I think that a variety of factors are coming into play in how the URL is working out at lower densities. California decided it. First, they said they were only going to use liters per connection no matter what. And they went and changed. Of the 400 utilities, they have about 10 of them that are on a per mile basis. If it were me, I would make life simple and just use liters or gallons per connection. But maybe offline, I would be interested to know what Alan and Kate think about how their adjustments to the UARL might impact the value of liters per connection at low densities. Is the old rule of thumb still good? So maybe we can get a short answer on that or go on to other questions.
We've got another one from Gary Trachman, I think. I do think it's useful to look at the cohorts, such as size, possible age of systems, and density of connections, for example. Would you like to comment that?
I'm sorry, can you read the question again? Cohorts and what?
I do think it would be useful to look at the cohorts such as size, possible age of systems, and density of connections, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think cohorts are useful for many, many things. I think that if you're doing a frontier analysis and if you are using a frontier score and you've already got miles and connections in it, then a cohort by density wouldn't, I don't think, add too much. But the other factors such as the water source, the climate, other things that are not in the modeling, or if you're not even using modeling, are useful. In Tennessee, I did a bunch of cohort analysis work looking at different river basins and water sources and what the range of real loss was in those cohort-based locations. I hope I've answered that question.
I think so. Any more questions? Alan, if you would like to say something else, or we can call it for today.
Well, I'm wondering, you know, to try to take this on in 10 minutes, let me throw out an idea, and maybe you'll need to answer me later. But one thought would be to do something on this in another webinar. And that could be more of an open discussion, because I know that, well, Alan, for example, has sent me some very interesting feedback on it, and I've started preparing a response. But there are, you know, this isn't figured out yet. I mean, there are still some issues. It's being used. I mean, I can give people a glimpse of it, but I don't want to try to go into it in great detail in 10 minutes, you know. But do we think another webinar might be a possibility? What do you think?
Think about that.
What?
Julia, would you like to comment that? I think we can think about that in another webinar.
Okay, all right. Well, let me just quickly show you. I'm going to jump through some slides, but basically what this is about is, well, the overall hope of this was that we could find a indicator that would address this issue of, do we have liters per mile or kilometer at very low densities and not have to switch from, let's say, liters per connection to liters per kilometer at some density? In other words, is there a unit real loss indicator that could work across all density ranges? And what Alan and one other person have noticed is, in their opinion, there is a density impact on this indicator, but I have a response which I'm working on. It's not quite figured out, but let me show you what the idea is. That you make a cross plot of, and I'm sorry to apologize, this is in gallons on the x-axis and gallons per mile on the y-axis. And if you were to multiply the value of the real loss, let's say at this point in, take this point, it has a certain gallons per mile and has a certain gallons per connection. If you multiply those two indicators and take the square root, you're kind of blending the two indicators and you get what I call the combined real loss indicator. And those locations which are far from the origin have a higher combined leakage. And those that are up here have a higher density. In fact, you can draw density lines. Whoops, didn't want to do that. Oh, well, since I'm here, this is something that Alan did some years ago, which is a very similar concept with slightly different axes, but you have those same kind of ISO curves that was on the previous slide. Wonder if I can go back. Yeah, there we are. All right. Well, as I was saying, you can, this is the area of low density sites, and this is the area of high density sites. Now, if you take a logarithm of it, of both axes, you get lines instead of ISO curves. And if I may jump ahead a little bit, this is something that Dave did on the English utilities using this method. Anglian water sets the frontier. This is California. One of the things I did in California is I defined the percentiles. So these people are between the 90th and the 100th percentile of real losses. These people here, these utilities here are between the 25th and 50th. So you begin to get a feeling of, at least using a percentile basis, where different utilities are using this combined measure. But like I say, there's still an open question on an impact from density. And just really quickly, Alan and Kate, what I'm interested to try to do is see how that density factor would play out with your revised UARL. And we can talk about that offline. So that's the idea, is that it hopefully produces a real loss indicator that doesn't need to be changed for density and is sort of easily graspable and is proportional directly to our friend Stuart Trowe's statement. In other words, it's directly correlated with the total real loss, which would suggest that it is a superior indicator. I've done the technical rigor with the frontier stuff, and it comes out very high. Not in every database, but high in all of them, or the highest in several databases and second place in one of the other ones. So, but the question of the density needs to be addressed. And I was contacted yesterday by a group from Toronto, or no, not Toronto, but another city in Ontario that's looking at this in terms of DMA performance. So, but it's not, let's say, fully vetted through a full peer review or technical review yet. Okay, I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's perfect. Would you like to say anything else?
Not really. I mean, unless there's any more questions that have come to mind. Do you see any popping up?
No, no more questions. Well,
okay.
I think thank you very much, Alan, for your great presentation, for being with us.
Thank you to all of you. And certainly if you think of things later on about why did you do that, Alan, and whatever, please let me know. Also, it will be published in the H2 Open Journal. And the earliest version is available from the AWWA. But you can also email me if you would like to have a presentation or a draft of the journal article, whatever. So anyway, thank you for participating, and I hope it was interesting and useful for you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody. Disconnecting now.